Welcome everyone to our Conversation in the Void Wednesday episode as our normal time frame. I am your host Graveyard, joined as always with my off-screen producer Salem. Make sure to say hi to him. He likes to hear from each and every one of you. Now I'm pleased to introduce our guest. He is a gamer, VTuber, and the head of our own monastery. Please welcome to the show, Mildra the monk.
Hello there. Thank you for having me. I enjoy being had.
Well, thanks for coming on. I know you have quite a few number of episodes, more than us for interviews, but it's astounding what you've been able to put out over a number of years, quite honestly.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I've been making content for over 10 years and I've been doing interviews for over 5. And in that time I've amassed over 1,000 interviews. The playlist that I have currently is at 1,022 videos total.
Yeah, that's. And like we're about episode 88 right now of this show, but it's growing. It's we do a couple episodes a week sometimes, and in October because it's spooky season, we do way too many shows. It's my co-host will tell you. So welcome, Mildra. I'd like to just get to know a little bit more about you before we kind of get into the meat and potatoes. So, what really brought you into the VTubing world as a whole?
I would say it was a natural progression. Like I was aware of it, but for the longest time I was like, I don't know if I want to dive headfirst into that because there's always an association with Japanese idol culture within it to a certain extent, and that's not really me. I don't sing, and I'm not cute. I'm not cute enough for that. I haven't sung or done any acting work in a long time. And most of the acting I did was stage acting, except for one bit of stunt acting that was enough for me to say I should not do that again. But I started doing a weekly podcast called Monastery Live. A lot of it was just reacting to various news and the sillier parts of news, like having at least one Florida man story a week, though other states got the same treatment. But because I was presenting it as Mildra the monk within a temple, and I used the Paro Taksang Monastery in Tibet as a visual rep for it, some of my colleagues who were more inundated with VTubing had said, "You're halfway there anyways, so you may as well rip that Band-Aid off."
Okay.
And I thought about it for a bit, and I realized the monastery thing, which was more representative for how I wanted to approach things as this sacred ground where the only thing that matters is the game that's being talked about or the film that's being talked about or whatnot. And which is why I use the Paro Taksang Monastery, since it's built off the side of a large hill.
Okay.
And I gradually realized that they may have had a point, that there may have been something to the idea of trying it out. So I reached out to a friend of mine, Jeremy Jack, who is a character designer by trade and the creator of the Planetbound TTRPG. And I pitched him an idea for a design, and I asked him if he could come up with a character sheet of a sort. And after a bit of back and forth, he nailed one down. I carried that over to a different artist who had more of a manga style instead of a comic book style, and asked him to reinterpret it so that could be ready for rigging. Then reached out to someone else, commissioned them to handle the rigging. The rest was history. I had a few assets set up, and I just went from there. Okay. And I had all that done about 5 months before I debuted it, because there's a certain stigma of VTuber personalities who constantly are in what's known as pre-debut, i.e. they haven't debuted their model yet for weeks, if not months at a time. And it's a case of get off the damn fence. And I didn't want that stink.
Right.
So I didn't announce that I was making the debut until about a week before I did. because I didn't want anyone to assume I was another one of those pre-debut types. It was like, no, if I'm putting it out there, I've already got a release date set up. It's happening. It's not will they, won't they kind of thing.
Right. That makes sense. Yeah, it's I'm very intrigued about your rig because I don't know anything about VTubing, quite honestly. So can you tell us like just kind of a quick rundown of like how that's even set up with something like OBS or StreamYard, just for people interested in that?
Now, the rigging part is essentially a rudimentary animation, which is why it can be kind of expensive. The setup I have cost about $500.
Oh wow!
But when you consider how expensive animation can get, that's actually modest. Like I remember reading a story that a single episode of Avatar: The Last Airbender cost $1 million in 2005 money.
Oh wow! Yeah.
Like animation, even with computer assistance, is still very expensive.
Right.
In some cases, it's more expensive than shooting on location for live action, because you're essentially having people do thousands, if not tens of thousands, of drawings.
Yeah. I mean, because live action, you generally have a background that you don't have to create; it's already there for you.
Yeah. Like a lot of those golden age Disney movies were animated on what's known as ones. Basically one unique illustration per frame.
Right.
And film is usually shot on 30 frames per second. So imagine that over a 90-minute movie.
Yeah.
And that's why bringing that to VTubing. Once I have a design set up that's ready to rig, it's put up in a program called VTube Studio, which is pretty standard for anyone using what's known as the Live 2D format. There are ones who do more 3D format with a lot more focused motion tracking, but I'm not one of them. And there's no shade for those who do it, but it's just a approach that I felt didn't quite work with what I was attempting, because I'm not going to be moving around or being all that animated. I'm going to be largely static while going through whatever notes I'm going through or whatever PDF I'm going through for a project. So I didn't see a reason to go full 3D. But if you're going full 3D is a different program than I would use. But obviously, having a webcam and having some decent lighting also helps. I have a decent Logitech one that has its own lighting setup. Some people will use special lighting to brighten things up. I don't need it. I have enough lighting in my current setup as it is.
Well, that's good. Yeah, my lighting in my office is not very good. I have a light overhead here, and I have my ring light right in front of me.
Yeah,
so that's all I got.
I've got a ring light, but I haven't had enough need to use it, and because of how my place is set up, if I did set it up that way, it would be right in my face, and that's not good for the eyes.
Yeah, that's very, very true. That's why my mind's just like right above me here, just to, that's why I have to wear a hat though, because I'm bald as I'll get out, and it'll just be reflective for everyone watching.
Oh yeah.
That's interesting, because it's it's a character that's made for you, so no one else has this character, right? And I think that's really interesting to see that. And I know you do a lot of stuff with like Geek Watches, and kind of everyone has their own avatar in that Geek Watch show too, right?
Yeah, Geek Watch was the reincarnation of my original podcast, Monastery Live.
Okay.
And it was one that we did because this was right in the middle of the nadir of the pandemic. And a lot of people involved were really getting sick of how a lot of the articles we were covering, and even I was getting sick of how a lot of them were focused so much on COVID related bullshit, essentially.
Yeah.
And I was like, we're repeating ourselves way too much, so I need to blow this up and take a different angle.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea of just talking about geek shit cropped up. I retitled it as Geek Watch and just went along with that. Like I think one of the first episodes we just did a whole thing talking about space westerns in anime and manga, and the idea of doing topic-based affairs started to come up, and then later on the idea of doing reconstructions of missed opportunities in storytelling, and everything kind of spiraled out from there. I am proud of some of the reconstructed attempts of missed opportunities we did. Like we did a whole one on the Star Wars sequels.
Oh, man,
that was built far more around taking Rey, Finn, and Poe, tweaking a few things about, and having it be a passing of the torch from one Trinity to the next.
Mm-hmm.
Although, in the case of someone like Rey, Rey and Finn, the approach we ended up taking was Rey has an Atlas complex, thinking she has to hold the world up by herself, whereas Finn is very good at what he can do, but he's not good at having his own initiative. So you have the kind of opposites there. And Poe, the approach we took was he's kind of stuck right in the middle and is in that position because it's protection from all of the people he's pissed off. I wanted to lean a bit into Constantine with how how even people who work with John Constantine absolutely can't stand him.
Yeah. When John Constantine walked into their door, they're just like, "Oh no, not you."
Yeah, mostly because either bad stuff happens when he shows up, or he's found some way to screw someone over.
Yeah, that's very true.
Or in the case of Papa Midnight, the answer is, do you have any idea how little that narrows it down?
Yeah, it's. But like I said, I listened to a couple of reconstructions. I listened to you talked about the Samurai Power Rangers seasons that were there. I also listened to your M. Night Shyamalan Maestro to Meme episode as well.
Yeah. We also did one roasting J.J. Abrams, and I still insist on calling him the California roll.
Yeah.
Because when it comes to sushi, the California roll is the most basic bitch kind of sushi you can get.
Yeah, I don't think there's even real fish in it. Some of them. I think it's just so my wife gets it. She doesn't like raw fish. So.
Mm-hmm. And I don't have as much of a problem with raw fish because I come from a family of fishing maniacs. I'll put it that way. And everybody does lakeside fishing as soon as fishing season starts.
Yeah.
I've got no issue with that. I only have issues when it comes to sushi. I only have issues with wasabi because I had an unfortunate case the first time. Everybody has that first time where they don't know better, so they just plop the whole wasabi thing in their mouth, not realizing what they've just gotten themselves into.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, it's fun. It's fun seeing that first moment.
Yeah. It's fun seeing that first moment. It's not so much fun when you are that first moment.
Correct. That's very, very true. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I introduced my kids to sushi like a year or two ago, and they love it, but they don't realize that the wasabi is hot. It's spicy for some people.
It gets in your sinuses, is what it does, because it's horseradish based.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I have one kid that loves hot stuff. I have another kid that thinks root beer is spicy. So that's the medium I have to work with here.
Yeah, I can understand that. And meanwhile, I get creative when it comes to spicy stuff if I need to punish my players sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
Like I have a concoction called the Pain Glass that I use if somebody gets caught cheating, which is a shot glass filled with water, salt, sea salt, pepper, black pepper, and about 3 different hot sauces. At least one of them is on the hot ones list.
Nice.
Nice. The other option is you have to drink a bottle of baking soda.
Jones's baking soda. Does it Jones still make it?
This was something I got at a candy shop where I live. It tastes like bacon grease mixed with club soda. It's absolutely disgusting.
It sounds like something Jones Soda Company would do because they did the whole Thanksgiving meal in one thing as well.
Yeah, I've been around enough to see some absolutely foul soda flavors. Some make me question whether or not we should bring back bullying. Last time I went grocery shopping, I saw ranch flavored soda. I'm like, why?
Wow, that's huh.
I've seen that. I've seen Tabasco flavored soda, which I'm like, if you want to just admit that you're a masochist, you can just outright say so. I know a few clubs.
Absolutely. But so you have that for your crew if they get caught cheating with this nastiness. And I kind of want to go touch base on your playing games and your tabletop RPGs. Mm-hmm. So how did you get into that? Do you remember like your first tabletop RPG and how you just got immersed into the world?
Yeah. Growing up, I was obsessed with the old Choose Your Own Adventure books and just game books in general. And I was obsessed with fantasy as much as the next guy. I mean, I grew up in the 90s, so so stuff like Hercules and Xena was required watching in my house.
Oh, absolutely.
And along with, I ended up seeing young Indiana Jones before I saw actual Indiana Jones, and all the different fantasy works when it came to animation or when it came to film that I was surrounded with that kind of stuff. Plus, I was a natural bookworm as it was. I was that kid who would go into a library at like 10 a.m. and I wouldn't leave until 10 o'clock.
Nothing wrong with that.
But I do remember doing that at a bookstore. They tried to kick me out. I'm like, if you didn't want me in here, you shouldn't have made such comfy couches. or have a coffee shop literally next door.
Yep.
You knew exactly what you were doing.
Oh yeah.
But then my mentor, who I've always given him the nickname of Old Man Bullhorn because he worked with a lot of hard of hearing kids and he had a habit of projecting his voice the way you'd project your voice on stage.
Mm-hmm.
But he couldn't turn that off.
Okay. So
he didn't shout. He just projected his voice all the time.
Mm-hmm.
But because I was a big fan of that kind of stuff, he got me into D&D. This was the Black Book era. And it was with the premise of an interactive version of what you were already doing.
Right.
It also helped that I was really into board games, so he was able to use that. He was able to use that to kind of ease the process.
Mm-hmm.
Even though some of the board games I had played a lot of, I'm pretty sure should be considered torture. Looking at you, Jenga.
Yeah.
But once I understood what it was, and that it was like I just went full bore and I didn't stop. Eventually, I started venturing out into other games. Some of them were certainly successful. Some of them a little bit less so. One of them has been my whipping boy for most of my life, and that is Rifts.
Don't think I've played that.
Rifts is an interesting beast from a setting perspective, but actually running it is an absolute nightmare because of navigation, a lack of proper balancing, and certain quirks that its creator Kevin Simbeta insists on.
Mm-hmm.
Like he even back in 1989, he was still doing analog editing when most of his colleagues were starting to move over to digital.
Ooh, yeah.
And I think even as recently as the 2000s, he was still doing analog editing. He was doing analog editing at the very least in 2004.
Wow.
Which, by that point, nobody was doing analog editing.
No, we're not. Huh.
But just going into game stores and just being exposed to a wide variety of different games. Going to, it wasn't long before I started running games myself, and I just went whole hog with it, and I kept going at it. When I saw the potential for covering it on places like YouTube and elsewhere, because I'd already written a review blog for a while. I decided, you know what? Everybody's talking about the big two entries. I wanted to take a different approach. I want to cover games outside of that. And that's been a big part of the channel ever since. And I've had the same channel for 10 years. I started when YouTube was still very, very young. I technically started my channel in the late 2000s, but it wasn't until 2014 that I started actually making videos.
Okay.
And originally I was just going to do reviews until I would get dragged into live stream conversations, and then that got the idea of, hey, maybe I can do this myself. And I tried it out, turned out very well, and I kept going. And same thing with interviews. It's been a constant case of testing the waters to see what I can actually do or not do.
Right.
Some things work, some things don't. But I've never tried to subject myself to the whims of what some algorithm says I should do. It's a case of, I'm going to do this because I feel like doing it, and if it works, great. If not, I'll just move on to something else.
Yeah, I mean that's honestly how you have to do it. You know, I started this show just because I do another show where we interview people, and a lot of horror people started coming to me. I'm like, you know, I could do a horror show, and then like our other podcasts that we have that we review 3 or 4 horror movies a week. My co-host and I, Salem, we started working together about 8 years ago together professionally, and we were just talking to each other like over the week, you know, Monday morning. What horror movies did you watch over this past weekend? Oh, and we just had this conversation, and, you know, a couple of years ago. You know what? We should just record this. And so we have been doing that for a couple of years now, and it's great. You know, it was a way for me to get back into YouTube because in 2007, 2008, I was making shorts and sketches and stuff like that, you know, where YouTube was limited to 10 minutes that you were able to do. And stupid me back then goes, this is not going to go anywhere. I'm going to stop. And I didn't come back for like, you know, 12 years. Unfortunately, I should have kept at it this entire time, but I'm here now. So,
yeah, hindsight is what it is.
Yeah. It's fun stuff though. I can tell by listening to your interviews and your guys' shows and your gaming stuff that you're just enjoying what you're doing, and I think that's, to me, more important than anything else. You know, I do horror video games at night. Not as many viewers with my horror video games. I play like Mario Maker on the Switch or like casual gaming stuff, get a lot more viewers. So you kind of have to balance that out for at least what I'm trying to do. You know,
and in the world of tabletop, obviously a lot of people do D&D, but for various reasons I don't. I'm well aware that if I did, I'd probably get a lot more eyes, but I look at that as the equivalent of indulging in junk food. Junk food might taste good or something, but it's not healthy for your overall diet.
Right.
You know, having a balanced diet, having a diet of a variety of things is going to be better off. And there's also the fact that a a big part of the ethos, and this is something I stated in my debut proper, is showing what's out there. And if I'm just covering something that everybody else is covering, I'm not doing that.
Right.
And there's also the fact that I've gradually found myself becoming a bit of a tailor of sorts when it comes to how I recommend games, especially in tabletop games. Like with you with a horror background, something like D&D is the last thing I would recommend to you.
I do play D&D, so I mean there is definitely that.
Yeah, but you'd be more likely to see me recommend you something like Shiver or Chill, which are games that are very much ostensibly built around varying forms of horror. Especially Shiver. I mean, it's handled gothic horror and slashers in equal measure.
I don't think I know that.
Yeah. And Chill is an old favorite from the Pace Setter folks, who, which is very much leaning into Hammer horror with a little bit of Buffyverse.
Ooh, yeah, you got me with Hammer horror and my wife with Buffy right there.
There has been a Buffyverse RPG, but that was years ago. It's kind of out of date. There's also been an Army of Darkness one.
Oh, do I?
But and of course I've come across a few games that lean more towards Nordic horror as well.
Oh, really?
And if somebody wanted to lean into more Stranger Things kind of things, then there's stuff like Kids on Bikes or Ghost Club that very much lean into that 80s that never was kind of thing. You know, if somebody wants to do the more comedic end of things, there's stuff like Ghast Bashers or Inspectors, which both of them are very much drawing upon Ghostbusters.
Okay, I'm down for that.
Yeah. Like,
yeah.
There is a whole universe of TTRPGs out there, and there's something for everybody. And because of that, I'm far more in leaning towards showcasing games that already fit the things that people are already a fan of before I even meet them.
Right.
Like I just as a recent example, I've covered a couple of games that very much lean into like the SCP side of things. One of them literally called SCP RPG. The other one being Triangle Agency.
Okay.
And there was also an interesting series of games called VHS, or Very Horror Stories. Each of which is a collection of games that are emulating certain horror genres.
Yeah.
So again, there's literally something for everybody.
Yeah, I started doing geek game nights at my house before COVID happened, and I was doing it every Friday because my wife was working. I had friends over, and I got really into like Betrayal as well. And I love Betrayal because you get to play your own horror story, right? I kickstarted Terror Escape a couple years ago. We literally just played that this past weekend as well, and it's just I try to get my wife involved with it. She can't do too many heavy RPG things, but we still have a lot of stuff, and it takes time to set up, but I enjoy it a lot.
The funny thing about that, it's funny you mentioned that heavy thing, because not every game is as crunchy as people think. Now I've seen, because one of the things that comes with the amount of experience I've developed is seeing a lot of the I'd like to try but arguments. And a common one is, oh, I'm not all that good at math. there are games out there that don't even use dice.
Right.
There are some games that don't even use randomizers, period.
Okay.
On the other hand, there are some games that uses their randomizers, not a standard thing, but like a Jenga tower, for instance, or use playing cards instead of dice. And everybody can get their hands on a deck of playing cards. You can get those for $1.
Right.
I've seen people say, "Oh, I'm not that creative," or I can't find a GM. When it comes to the whole not that creative, you get a group of people together and they will help you out. And when it comes to the whole not having a GM thing, you can pay GMs these days.
Really?
Huh. Yeah. There's sites like startplaying.games where you can hire a GM to run a one shot of a given game.
Interesting. It makes sense, honestly, because it's always been that thing. Like, I grew up, late 80s, early 90s and playing, D&D, and our DM at that point in time, he's like, I want someone else to DM so I can play as just a character and not worry about the world building and everything else. And so we did that for a while. We were switching it up. Then, as we were like realizing that we're doing these characters, we just go, you know what, natural progression, backyard wrestling. That's that's where we went. D&D, the backyard wrestling.
Yeah.
So interesting.
Yeah. And I've often told people that the only thing that limits you from trying out is ultimately yourself, just like in any other thing. But it frustrates me when people say, "Oh, I'd like to try," because what it ends up telling me is that they don't actually want to. They just want the appearance of it, or they don't want to let me down or something. So it's a case of being half-hearted. And if you really want to try, you'll find a way. Like if somebody wants to watch a certain movie or get a hold of a certain thing, they're going to find a way to do so. I'd make the whole life finds a way joke, but that's a little too obvious.
Right. No, that's good, because having, you are their guru then for tabletop RPGs too. It's just to, talk about that, because I never heard of Shivers at all, honestly. I've looked into it. It's something that I would like to look into more, just because I'm always looking for good games to play. I'm also old school, where I have 13 Dead Drive at my house. The old, remember that? I love that, just because it's a tabletop, and I do I've always enjoyed board games. But no, it's awesome. It's awesome to be able to do that, and then to showcase that as well on your channel. Yeah, it's just a way to people just get to know the game and see you and a group of people play it too.
Yeah, it's for about a year or so, I've been doing an actual play series called Cloister the Dice, and one of the things I wanted to do with that was highlight transparency, as well as use it so that other game designers could use the space to do one shots of their games.
Right.
It's on a bit of a break right now because we're between major campaigns.
Okay.
But I'm going to be picking that up hopefully sometime next month, covering 7th Sea, which is a very swashbuckling kind of game. And I've already got some plans in mind for that, but I've gone through like 5 different campaigns over the course of a year and change. D&D has not been used once. Some of my players are burnt out on D&D or have their own issues as to why they will not touch that game. So because of that, it means I don't have the temptation of running it, which is fine with me because I wasn't going to do that anyways. I wasn't going to run D&D or Pathfinder or anything like that, for various reasons, least of which everybody else is doing it, but also there's been things within that company that I do not approve of.
Yep, that's very true.
And there's also the fact that when it comes to certain genres of storytelling, I would much rather find a game that is tailor built for that instead of forcing a game that isn't to be it. Like,
right.
I would, instead of doing, if I wanted to run a cyberpunk campaign, instead of trying to make a high fantasy game more fit in a cyberpunk setting, I would much rather just use a game that already encompasses cyberpunk and just go with that.
Right. And that makes sense. It does, because Roll20 exists obviously for all that stuff. So, but I remember trying to adapt Star Wars in the 90s to D&D with somewhat fun success, but I only did it once.
Yeah. Well, if you had asked me in the 90s, I would have said just grab Star Wars D6. Obviously, in the 2000s, there was Saga Edition, which was actually really, really good.
Okay.
I did a few years ago. I did a retrospective on different Star Wars RPGs, starting with D6, then doing Star Wars Revised, which was not good, then Saga Edition, then the FFG trilogy, and all of them had their different ups and downs, and I think the reason something like Saga Edition worked as well as it did is because even though it's using the D20 system, it's not trying to be compatible with D&D or use the same framework.
Okay.
It basically taking the framework to its skeleton and then building Star Wars around that. Complete. Like, for example, instead of doing the whole alignment thing, it has a whole system about character destinies and fulfilling them, which is far more in line with Star Wars than anything else, or the fact that it's not trying to force the Force into the wizard style casting, because that would just not work. And there's a school of thought in the game design space called System Does Matter. This idea of building the system around what you're trying to get out of it instead of trying to force a round peg into a square hole. And it's one that I am always going to have a preference for. There are certain games out there that are built for doing multi-genre affairs. GURPS is one of the big heavy hitters when it comes to that. But that does come with a cost. Those kind of games will always have a higher floor because they're less of a game and more of a programming language for the kind of game you want to make. I liken them to the blue bucket of Legos everyone had as kids.
Yeah.
Because, the one that just had a random assortment that you would freestyle, as opposed to a playset that had specific instructions on how you'd handle it.
Yep. I never got those kits growing up. I just had the bucket.
Yeah. And there's nothing wrong with either approach, but they are different approaches. And for me, it's a case of understanding what someone is already a fan of and then pointing them in the direction of stuff that will more likely gravitate towards. This is also why I've been very critical of the way people view, say, fantasy or other genres by taking one approach and acting like that's the totality of it. In fantasy, I call this the Tolkien melting pot. And I don't have anything against Tolkien's work, obviously, but I resent the idea that if I'm writing fantasy, that's what I have to write. In the same vein, I remember when I did cover Shiver originally, and this is a problem that they've since amended.
Mm-hmm.
I'd said that horror is something that has a lot of different angles. I mean, you have the more gothic affairs, you have the neo gothic affairs we saw in the '90s. You have the slashers. You have the more surrealist affairs. Uh, you have the more dark fairy tale things that go bump in the night kind of affairs. And when you have that kind of setup, it's important to pick a lane.
Right.
Now, the lane that Shiver eventually settled on is more in the slasher end of things, but they did make concessions for gothic horror with one of their expansions.
Okay.
But that's just one example with that kind of thing.
Right.
And I've seen some games label themselves as horror RPGs, but it's very clear that they are leaning more towards slashers or the like. There's nothing wrong with that, but don't at the same time tell me that you can use this to run any kind of horror campaign when that's clearly not the case. The phrase "don't piss on my head and tell me it's raining" comes to mind.
Right. And it's good to see that you're able to do that. And, that's why I like Betrayal, at the House on the Hill, because there's 100 different scenarios and they're not all the same goal, right? So you can have a slasher, but you have everyone that there's just a separate entity. There's an evil possession. You have to get a cursed object to get to a certain room to different spell, and it's just 100 different ways to play.
Yeah. I remember reading an old magazine that was reviewing a bunch of different games, and it said Chill was a horror game for the easily frightened, and it criticized the game for not being scary enough in its opinion. Which would have been a fair comparison, would have been a fair argument to make if it weren't for the fact that that the type of scares that it was asking for, it wasn't trying to do. Like as I said, it was aiming more for hammer horror than say Golden Age Universal.
Right.
And one of the expansions for the old Pacesetter era had a module that had Elvira on the cover. They knew exactly where they were aiming.
Yes, yeah.
And I remember commenting about that article, and I was just going, I don't think it's quite fair, or at best, or disingenuous at worst, to criticize a game for not being the same level of scary as, say, Call of Cthulhu, when they're not, for lack of a better term, playing the same game.
Right. Yeah. Huh.
And if I'm running a horror game, I would be more inclined to run some sort of dark fairy tale, because I've been vocal in the past about how even as a kid I found werewolves more scary than vampires, because I lived in places where those kind of wild animals were not an uncommon sight. Like in certain parts where I grew up, you did have to keep an eye out for wolves, or you'd have to take certain precautions to make sure you didn't hit deer on the highway.
Yep.
Oh yeah. I've seen what happens when the battle between truck and deer happens. Truck loses.
Yes, it does. Deer loses too, but truck definitely loses as well.
Yeah. Or worse, further north, where it's truck versus moose.
Yeah, moose are quite a bit bigger.
A bit bigger and a bit nastier, and have a general hatred for everybody.
Yeah,
why there's the running meme of the moose are the true rulers of Canada.
It's very true. Very true.
They just do everyone a kindness by allowing people to vote on prime ministers and the like.
Yeah, for sure. All right, Mildra. So let's we're about that time here. So let's get into some of these wrap-up questions. I have changed them for you, and just because of what you do. So, I always ask practical or CGI for people for movies, but do you ever feel that do you like virtual gaming more than just like having the game on a table in front of you?
For me personally, I'm well aware that there is a lot of debate on the matter. There are some people I have met who absolutely swear by no VTTs ever, in person or nothing. But I honestly am ambivalent towards the matter. My policy has been, I don't care how you get to the dance so much as the fact that you're at the dance.
Right.
Because even before VTTs were a thing, I was doing games through things like play by mail or play by email or play by forum posts, and in some cases play by phone with some duet games that I did over the years.
Okay.
And because of that, VTT just seemed to be just another medium. I didn't see a difference between that or the play by mail games that I was involved in when I was very young. So if I were to chastise VTT, for instance, I would look like a massive hypocrite.
Right.
So my attitude is I don't care which one is done, so long as they're actually playing.
Right.
And doubly so if they're playing a game that is not the big two.
Right.
Like if they're playing if they're playing a game that's on the indie side of things, but they're doing it virtually, they're still playing. So as far as I'm concerned, my job is done.
Right. Okay. Now, have you thought about? You may have. Have you created your own RPG yet, or have you thought about creating one?
I'm in the process of that, actually.
Okay.
Now, granted, this is not a commercial product. This is a fan project just to see how far I could take it. But for the last 3 years, going on for next month, I have been making a TTRPG that's my group's own little take on doing the Final Fantasy series in TTRPG form, called Legend Edition.
Okay.
It is currently in beta. It is nearly finished. The only thing that's missing is the advanced rules and then a final editing pass. And it is, outside of that, it is completely playable. It's been on, it has its own page on itch.io, and it has had that for quite some time. We publicly debuted the thing at the Sonic Amateur Games Expo last year, and was actually the first TTRPG to be showcased at that event.
Oh wow!
And it was something that it was, because I'm a big fan of Final Fantasy. Obviously, I mean, if I wasn't, I wouldn't have made the game. But
right.
it wasn't just I wanted to do my favorite entries. No, I wanted to take the whole of the franchise and the mythos that it's developed over the years, and present a sandbox that one could use with that. And I do wear the influences on the sleeve, but there was a lot of studying from just the games themselves to even the stuff that was left on the cutting room floor, which, if you know anything about game development or even film development, you know there's a lot of stuff that's left on the development table.
Oh yeah.
And studying that kind of thing to get ideas, or looking at interviews from developers, or just any bit of info that I could get, as well as learning from other people who've attempted this particular concept in the past. It was built on the idea of making a crunch medium, highly customizable affair that is just as viable if someone was to draw upon the NES or SNES era of Final Fantasy, as opposed to the PlayStation eras or beyond that. a lot of the existing ones very much skewed towards the SNES era, which there's nothing wrong with those games, but there's whole generations who do not have as much of an attachment to that era as opposed to later ones.
I mean, I definitely have attachment to the Super ones, for sure.
Yeah, which is fair, but I've met just as many people who have more attachment to some of the later generations of games, and the idea of forcing people to build around the SNES era when that may not be where their mind is at is something that I wanted to address. Some of it comes from the fact that in the process of getting people into TTRPGs, I've been exposed to a lot of different backgrounds when it comes to how people approach different genres. I'm pretty sure there's a whole generation who got into horror through the original Saw film.
That's a heck of a jumping point.
A heck of a jumping point, but I've seen enough cases where the possibility is there.
Right. Yeah.
And I think that's something to consider. And I see James Navarro in the chat saying, "Do you plan to release it?" The thing's already out. Like, the beta's already out in the public. It's been out for months.
Yeah. You have to put that into the chat here so we can share it too.
Let me put that I'll put that in the private chat.
Yeah.
In the private chat.
Yeah.
Like, there's the itch page for the thing. A lot of the race and class art I had commissioned, and some of the weapon art I commissioned personally because I had a particular vision that I wanted to go with. Like, for example, you see the entry for dwarves on the itch page.
Yeah.
I had specifically said, do not give me D&D style dwarves. Think less of that and more of miners and trench uniforms. That was the direction I gave my artists on the matter.
Yeah. Oh, I see that. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Familiar but different was a watchword for a lot of the design direction. You can kind of see that with the Elzen, which are the equivalent of elves.
Right.
Like, I didn't want to go with the noble high elf approach. I was like, we already have the concept of wood elves in some settings. Let's go far more barbarian-esque for elves.
I like it. Yeah. Oh yeah.
And obviously there's that Moogle there at the bottom. I don't know what prompted the idea of going with a mailman aesthetic for Moogles, but it's stuck in my head. So I was like, yeah, I had sent my artist pictures of like U.S. Postal Service uniforms from like the 50s as a point of reference, and it just worked out from there.
Yeah,
but obviously I didn't do it alone. I have a couple people helping on graphic design. I have my good buddy Xanatrix, who was the co-designer and editor-in-chief, and he will insist on being referred to as editor-in-chief at every opportunity. But the overall direction was yours truly, and any sort of suggestion or change or whatnot goes through me.
Okay.
I have talked a lot about the importance of having that guy. Sometimes that guy is not a guy, but it's important to have that guy on any given project. That one person who the buck stops with. Because I say a lot. I say one of the I don't say the deciding factor, but a major deciding factor in certain projects just not panning out is a lack of clear direction.
Right. Yeah. Someone has to say this is. Yeah. You said it's the buck stops here. They have to say this is it. We're moving forward. this is what we're saying. So be it.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I remember reading a story about how there was an argument with the early Justice League comics where some of the writers for it did not some of the writers for Batman did not want Batman on the cover because they thought it would lead to brand dilution. And DC had to step in and say, they don't own the characters, we do. We're saying put him on the cover, so you put him on the damn cover.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Because of the way a lot of lines were organized into fiefdoms, doing crossovers was an absolute nightmare. Where you might have somebody who has an idea of doing a crossover, but then the editors for some of the characters involved in that crossover, like, no, you can't use this character, or you can't use this character unless you make these references, and it becomes a mess.
Right. Yeah.
So it's important to have that that controlling voice.
Oh, absolutely.
And if I were to use a horror example of that controlling voice, one of the big missed opportunities of the 90s was The Faculty.
Yes.
Especially years later when I revisited it and I discovered what the original plans were before somebody stepped in and was like, no, we got to make this more hip, which is the most 90s way to put it. But the fact that it was trying to do the whole student body as a hive mind, which would certainly be an effective brand of horror for that time. Almost doing a horror like, I think one of the original pitches was a horror like spin on The Breakfast Club.
Yes.
And if they had committed to that kind of thing, I think The Faculty would have been better remembered.
Yeah, I can see that. I can see that.
And I've at the same time I've said that I know that it's easy to hate on like the Saw franchise, but the first 3 movies of that I actually liked. Everything after that was a case of just throwing stuff out there and seeing what sticks, because of the fact that they had to follow up, but nobody really had an idea of what to do.
Yeah,
because the whole thing's built around Jigsaw, and how do you really follow it up when he's
dead? Yeah. Well, you just do a sequel 20 years later that takes place between 1 and 2.
Yeah, though, when you're doing those sort of in-betweeners or prequels or the like, when you already know how things are going to end, it can take a bit of the edge off. That's not to say that those kind of things can't work. I think it can when you make the ride interesting enough,
right?
I.e., how somebody got to be that. But it is a case where if you're not careful, it can blow up in your face.
Oh yeah.
But getting back to this project, once it's fully out, the plan is I'm just going to put out the full PDF on itch, then work on the expansion book called the Ultimania Guide.
Okay.
And just go from there, as well as do things like hosting design jams or the like. As much as I would like to get virtual tabletop support for it, I don't have the means to do that, and I haven't done programming in any capacity for at least a decade.
Okay.
Because in order to like build a custom character sheet in Roll20, I would have to mess around with HTML coding, and I haven't done that in years.
Yeah, same. It's probably been 20 years for me.
I stopped doing it because a long time ago, as I did QA work.
Okay.
And I was one day while I'm out getting groceries, I end up hallucinating lines of code while I'm shopping. And I immediately, when I get home, call up my boss, and I said, I got to get out of here. I'm putting in my 2 weeks because I don't want to end up. I just hallucinated the code that I saw this morning. I don't want to end up in a padded cell in a month.
Right. Awesome. Well, I can't wait for this to come out, and you'll have to keep us posted so we can spread the word too. So,
well, like I said, it's not a case of coming out. It's a case of it's in a playable beta at this stage. I wanted to make that clear.
Right.
People have been using it to run their own campaigns. There's one person who's been doing an actual play for a few weeks now.
Oh, nice. Awesome. Awesome. Well, Mildra, give us your plug, Will, so we can wrap up the show here. We're at time. Where can people find you, follow you, and learn all about you, and just follow this project as well?
I try to keep my socials pretty consistent. So on YouTube, you can find me under at Mildra the Monk VT, all one word. On both Twitter and Blue Sky, it's Mildra the Monk. I'm also on Twitch. I do multi-streaming on YouTube and Twitch. Also under Mildra the Monk. That's Mildra. And I'm always doing something.
Yes, you are. You're very busy.
Yeah. Tomorrow I'm going to be doing the Valley of the Judge series, which is my deep dive series. And on Monday I'm going to be doing a look at some of the indie games that were showcased at the III initiative, as well as ones that were announced around the same time. Since focusing on indies is a big part of the ethos, as I mentioned, and it's one that I take seriously enough to refer to it as a crusade.
Nice. I love it. You gotta support indie. I do indie horror films, so indie support indie. That's the way you gotta do it.
If you don't mind, I would like to address one question that was asked by C. Asnable in the chat.
Yeah.
He had asked earlier, what's your opinion of the VTubing community now? Like any community, it is a case of constant flux. I realize that part of the reason that's being asked is because there have been some very high-profile graduations, which is where somebody is graduating in that space is when somebody is essentially retiring that particular character to focus on other things, or even especially if they're associated with a organization.
Okay.
That doesn't mean they stop. They might go full independent under a different name, or use the name that they're already using independently, just going back to it. But it is a case of flux, and I've always been hesitant about using terms like the blank community, because you have a bunch of individuals who are making their own content and are self-motivated, as any independent entertainer has to be. So I don't really consider myself as part of the VTubing community, because I'm too busy trying to build my own community with the Monastery,
right? Which
is a community that reflects the approach I take and how I want to do things. But I have no association with any other corpo or group aside from the groups that I directly work with, like V Riot. And these sort of changes and fluxes are gonna happen with any group or any medium. And at this point, it's reached a stage where VTubing is a medium in the same way that other forms of entertainment are. Like there's no unified community when it comes to, say, stand up. You know, you have the appearance of a community born out of a bunch of individuals.
Right.
Same with any form of entertainment. And I reject this idea that I'm part of any collective in that sense. And when you have a bunch of individuals, things are going to ebb and flow all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And I realize why I'm saying this kind of thing, as the monk, but these sort of changes are going to happen. And for me, it's just a case of seeing where things are going and figuring out what I need to shift around, or even if I do need to shift around. And in a lot of cases, I don't, because there's not many people who are doing what I'm doing. And even if there was, I don't see them doing it to the same degree. So I don't have a lot of the big names could disappear off the face of the earth tomorrow. I'd still be doing what I've been doing for the last 10 years.
Right.
Like even as a VTuber, I didn't change my content.
Mm-hmm.
It always has been about showcasing what's out there and portraying it as I'm on a mission from God to showcase it, because Blues Brothers is one of my favorite games, so I had to get that joke out of there.
Of course.
And you've probably walked into a restaurant and asked for 4 fried chickens and a Coke. But the stuff that I do, that I've been doing for the longest time, that doesn't change. That didn't change. The only thing that changed was the appearance. And that's how I plan on continuing. I don't, unless somebody ties me down and forces me, I'm still going to be doing what I'm doing. And even if they did tie me down, I'm like, you're going to need more rope.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Mildra. It's been good having you on here, and we'll see you next time. So, yeah. And anyone who's new to this channel, follow us on all social media, Pod at Night. We're that easy here. So thank you, Mildra, again for coming on. We'll see you next time. Have a good night.
Stay frosty.
All right. Bye.